Mr. Peckford, it's a pleasure having you on the series today. Um, for my guests who aren't as fortunate enough to be familiar with your work and your time in office, can you give a little background of yourself?
Yes, sure. I got involved in politics in 1972 in the province of Newfoundland and Labrador. And I was elected to the legislature of Newfoundland in March 1972 as the first Conservative member for that riding in the history of that riding, which went back over 150 years. After becoming the member of the legislature for that Northeast Newfoundland riding called Green Bay, I became a executive assistant and parliamentary assistant to the then premier a few months later. And then after that, in 1974, I became a Minister of Municipal Affairs and Housing. And then that led to the Minister of Mines and Energy, which involved me in the offshore oil and gas issues, for which I'm perhaps best known, as well as the Charter Rights and Freedoms. And then in 1979, at the age of 36, I won the Progressive Conservative leadership and became Premier of the province from March 1979 until March 1989. I had indicated when I got elected that if I was successful, I would stay 10 years. And I stayed exactly 10 years to the months. I tried to get it to the day, but it was impossible to get a venue. But it was within the month, March 1979 to March 1989. I served as the first minister of the province of Newfoundland and Labrador.
That's incredible.
And just after getting elected, within the year, I was involved in the constitutional issues, because they began and went on for over 17 months, leading to November 1981. And so I hadn't been elected very long as First Minister when I was engaged as Intergovernmental Affairs Minister as well as Premier. I kept the Intergovernmental Affairs portfolio for myself.
Right.
And so therefore I was involved on behalf of the government in the talks very early on. As a matter of fact, I have right here before me a document which is towards the 21st century together, the position of the government of Newfoundland regarding constitutional change, August 1980.
Jeez.
Over a year before the Patriation Agreement of November 1981. I've kept a copy of that. Many people, unfortunately, have skewered this whole constitutional process. And very often, even judges of the Supreme Court had sort of questioned when I got involved and made our position known as it related to the Charter and all that kind of stuff. Well, it's all in this written document, which was sent to all the governments in Canada, including, of course, the federal government, in August 1980.
That's remarkable.
We were one of the first governments to put in writing exactly our position as related to constitutional change. And in there, of course, it talks about our support, active support for a Charter of Rights and Freedoms.
Right. That's remarkable. Well, first, I have to say to you, Brian, thank you for your service. And thank you immensely, for my generation, prior generations, and going forward, for your contributions to the Constitution and to the Charter specifically.
Yes.
What do you think, Americans take such great pride. You can't not use that element of their Constitution. They seem to know a fair bit, yet we Canadians, I don't want to say a younger generation specifically, but seemingly we don't necessarily take pride in our Constitution. And I would say even to a greater degree, more progressively detrimental degree, we don't seemingly have any understanding of our constitutional rights in Canada and our individual rights in Canada.
That's very true. And in all of the speeches I've given over the last 2 or 3 years, both by Zoom like this to crowds and in person, and I just gave an address a couple of weeks ago down in Victoria to the We Unify conference, where I talked about this again, this whole question of why Canada does not have the same understanding and appreciation of their individual rights and freedoms as does the Americans. Now, the Americans, after they became independent in 1776, it was 1791 that the actual Bill of Rights came into existence in America. So they have lived with a written Bill of Rights since 1791. Ours never came into existence until 1982.
Right.
So therein lies one of the issues. The other issue is, I guess, when you become a country through conflict, physical conflict, it has a more lasting impression on you if you go ahead and create that country out of that conflict than if you do it through the means by which Canada did it in talks with the United Kingdom or the old country or Britain and the Upper Canada, Lower Canada, Nova Scotia, and New Brunswick, who were the original provinces of the Confederation. So one, they have a written Bill of Rights in their Constitution as of 1791. Ours wasn't until 1982. And secondly, their country was created out of a wholly different cultural milieu than ours was. I think these are two of the main reasons for that. The common law of England and of Britain, which applied, the Constitution Act of 1867, creating the country, said nothing about individual rights and freedoms, because we came out of peacefully, both to our detriment and to our benefit.
Right. Good point.
We came out of it in a different way, and therefore we're reliant upon British common law. And from 1867 onward, there were many attempts over the years. Because we lived on the North American continent, we're always reminded about the, quote, written Constitution in the United States. How come we don't have a written Constitution on Bill of Rights like they do that we can refer to, rather than to have to go through a convoluted legal process whereby it would be determined whether, in fact, my particular case on individual rights met any standards of common law in precedent unwritten.
Right. And that that's a really good point there. I think that I really like that point, because that always reminds me of something growing up, from documentaries, from reading to, in high school, primary school, but also in high school, and then certainly beyond that, is in those critical conversations, in those critical moments, it always seemed that parties, regardless of one's political strike, it almost seemed like those who were opposed to it seemed like it was a kind of an Americanization of Canada, which I think is such a false entity, such a false view, because constitutionality is, and I as I like to say, Brian, is liberalism is the bifurcation of conservative and liberal, and liberalism is what the Western world, and a constitution isn't left, right, American. It's not British. It's a people's thing.
You're so right, and I'm so glad you hit upon that point, because it unfortunately, when the mouse lives next to the elephant, the characterization takes over from the substance of an issue. Same way in healthcare and so on in Canada vis-a-vis the United States, and it's unfortunate that during the time when these things got debated, it was often talked about, well, all you want to do is litigate. All you want to be like the Americans. And that has been very much to our detriment. and to the detriment, I suspect, of many small countries that live next to a larger country. And in our case, it's so true because as we both developed, the impact that the United States had upon Canada, forget about the physical trade part of it, but just in communications.
Right.
Just in communications and transportation, but mainly in TV as the electronic revolution developed, we became more a subject of and a listener to and a viewer of American programming than we did Canadian programming. Mm-hmm. And so therefore it happened, and more importantly, it happened in things that are crucial and of course help contribute to making that kind of erroneous description, and therefore demean what it was we were trying to do in establishing a Charter of Rights and Freedoms.
Right, precisely. And when you look at today, there seems so many ushering backwards, in a very true sense, ushering backwards to a kind of desire for a group right as opposed to the individual rights, and we fall back into that so swiftly, and it's such so swiftly we do, and it's like, why? It's never like, oh, that's why. It's like I can never put my finger on it. It's like, because at the same time, Brian, I think there's a Canadian conundrum, is we have a kind of existential crisis of who are we? Who are we as a nation? And it's the big thing during your time prior in office in the 60s with Trudeau Sr. trying to bring about the Pan Canada. Who are we? And I think ironically that never came to be because we're so diverse prior to even that notion being used in the way it is. You look at where you are out east, out west. They might as well be two different continents. Central Canada might as well be a third continent. And then you have these are so vast with traditions, history, culture.
Yeah, and that's why people don't understand. And even Trudeau Sr. didn't. And many of the historians who have written at that time and since about that time failed to grasp what a federation, and in our case, the nature of our Canadian Federation, right, vis-a-vis Germany or Switzerland or Australia or the United States, who are all federations, but we're all federations, but we're all different.
Precisely.
And 1981, when the impasse of getting a patriation agreement, including a Charter of Rights and Freedoms, was halted after 17 months of negotiation by Trudeau Sr., who attempted to unilaterally patriate the Constitution, incorporating in it his version of a Charter of Rights. Here's where the big problem has come, and I'm glad to have this opportunity with you today, and I wish I had more people who approach this situation the way you are, because I don't get as great an opportunity in a lot of other interviews to do that, because you're getting really close to home here. So we were negotiating for like 15, 16 months, and we were always wary as provinces. Here we are, federation, provinces, right, states in the United States, states in Australia, states in Germany, all federations, cantons in Switzerland, wary of what Trudeau Seniors would do once we got into negotiations. And Quebec and perhaps Alberta sometimes, and myself would argue that we had to be really, really careful, because this is a federation, and we value our provincial rights and we value the federal rights, but it is a federation. And lo and behold, when things got really, really tough over the agenda of negotiating out, remember, the Charter of Rights and Freedoms was only a part of the Patriation Agreement. Right. The Constitution Act 1982, which is the Patriation Agreement, put into legislation, is 60 items. Mm. Okay. And the Charter only makes up part of those, of that 60 items, right? 34. Right. 34 of those 60 deal with the Charter. What does the rest deal with? In other words, This was a big, big package of stuff, and not just a charter rights of freedoms. Get back to my point. So Trudeau left the table. Trudeau Sr. left the table, and the whole patriation thing was off. And he said, I'm going to pay. These are too difficult negotiations. They're not going to succeed. I'm leaving the table. He left the table and said, I have the power as the prime minister through the federal parliament to patriate unilaterally with a charter rights and freedoms. We, the provinces who opposed this, of which there were 8, opposed it and took him to court. And at the last minute, with some opposition from the loyal opposition in the parliament, the prime minister decided, Trudeau Sr. at the last minute, to do a reference to the highest court, the Supreme Court of Canada, as we were having our appeal courts, having our decisions appealed to the Supreme Court of Canada, and it got culminated all in one case in September 1981. This is extremely important because I have down here, I have around me books, a lot of them Canadian books, the history of Canada, where they completely misinterpret, or what shall I say, skewer what happened during that time. This is Don Gilmore's book with CBC, People's History, 2 volumes. It came out right after the patriation. You might have seen it. A very volume, 2 big books, like coffee table books. But it's full history. Okay. But right on this plan, Trudeau's plan to patriate the Constitution without the provinces, consent was challenged in court. This is from a history book, which is considered to be, sort of definitive because it had a whole bunch of historians, a whole bunch of academics, very, very well-known, highly thought-of academics. The premiers were disappointed, however, when the Supreme Court, while declaring the Trudeau's initiative would be in contravention of constitutional conventions, did not rule it illegal. But the point is, the Constitution overrides the technical illegal point that Don Gilmore made in that book.
Right.
And Trudeau Sr. recognized that. So the court at that time, I don't know if the Supreme Court of Canada would do the same today, have that same decision. Really good question, which comes to why I'm into this battle.
Right.
Because they were real friends of Trudeau Sr. at the time, but they put the law and the Constitution first, and their friendships second, and their loyalties politically or whatever other way. And every Canadian who has the ability to read a document, a legal document, and this is not really hard to read, that 1981 decision of September, Canadians who go to university and study law and who study history should be forced mandatory to read that decision.
Yeah.
Because it goes through the whole history of Canada and reaffirms federal nature.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
The court rule, you can't do this, Trudeau Sr. It's unconstitutional because it doesn't involve the provinces. And you must have a substantial number of provinces on side to make these kinds of changes, which impact upon the federal nature because it'll impact upon some of the powers of the provinces.
Precisely. And that's, again, Brian, I got to say on a side note here before I say what I want to say is I'm proud to be having this conversation with you because these are the kind of, specifically, this is the topic I love more than anything. I mean, I'm 31, but this is a passion for me. I love this. This is a pure passion.
Okay.
And it's one of the things I think we should take pride in of our, how do I say this? We should take pride in our uniqueness and the particularity of our uniqueness within the context of the provinces and the territories. And by that I mean, one of the things I've always has given me some sort of stupid nerdy joy. I say that is whomever holds office, whatever party, our federalism is morphological. And that is something so, I mean, my nerdiness is on 100 right now. I'm tingling because that is so pivotal, I think, to understanding what it means to be Canadian, and particularly in a political way. I don't care if you're left, right, center, up,
No,
down,
exactly,
crisscross,
exactly.
no party. That is a particularity of the Canadian story, the political
And they
story.
only, when I talk, as I've talked now about the premiers, I'm just talking about them as first ministers. I don't mention their
Exactly.
political
Yeah.
affiliation.
I
It
mean,
has to do with the idea of Canada and
yes.
how we tried to in 1981, not just Pierre Trudeau, but all of us. We were all interested in this. This
Yes.
was about the 11th or 12th time in our history that we tried to do this,
Yes.
and it almost did not succeed. They almost did not succeed. Whereby we not only did we not only acknowledge but put in the Constitution is the supreme law of Canada.
Mhm.
Right? Like people talk to me about, well, what about the Bill of Rights that Diefenbaker passed in 1960? And I, even to this very day, I have to point out to people that was an act of the federal parliament.
Yeah.
The federal parliament is not Canada. Canada is Nunavut, Yukon, Northwest Territories, BC, Newfoundland, Nova Scotia, Ontario. All of that makes up Canada.
Precisely.
Okay.
Precisely.
And so therefore, the last wording in the Bill of Rights of 1960 was, this applies to only federal jurisdiction.
Right.
Has no applicable to provincial jurisdiction in BC or Newfoundland or Nova Scotia or anywhere else in Canada. In other words, it was not pan-Canadian, it was federal.
Yeah.
And federal is only one part of the mosaic
Exactly.
of what is Canada.
Exactly. And I've always liked that analogy of the mosaic. I liked how Venier put it. He said, "We are the grand mosaic building ever upwards." I like that because it gives a very particular picture. In other words, we're not stagnant. And that's in particular because when, through a constitutional project and the process of interpretation, we invoke both colloquially the growing tree approach as well as the framers approach. And I think that's key. We don't just focus on one particular viewpoint, but we engage in both. How do we adapt to modernity and how do we hold on to traditionality? Right. Which is so key too, because none of it's
and that flexibility was there. For example, where did Nunavut come from?
Exactly.
That never happened in 1920. That never happened in 1867. That never happened in 1960. It happened only 10, 15 years ago, where a new territory was created, right, for the Inuit of this nation.
Yes.
A new territory which has its own parliament in Nunavut. And that's what you're talking about, right? It's a project which is greater than any one of its parts.
Exactly. And that, I think, is the immensely humbling thing about it. It humbles you in office. It humbles you as a citizen of Canada. It humbles you when you realize that it's greater than any one part. It is.
And then the other part of it is, and that's why it was so difficult to get a patriation, because you couldn't have having a constitution being completely, or a country being completely sovereign, unless you had a mechanism by which it could be changed. In other words, the amending formula. And the amending formula was always one of the big stumbling blocks to finishing the Canadian project as a completely sovereign nation. That was one of the things, was the amending formula. And that's extremely important. Once again, it's very often downplayed today, and why I take the position, for example, on the Charter as it relates to Section 1 and the preamble, which whereas this nation is founded upon the principles, right, of the supremacy of God and the rule of law. That's the framework in which all court decisions relating to the Charter should be made, should be established. And if we want to change that, we have an amending formula through which it can be changed. It should not be changed by the courts.
Right.
And which takes us to another area.
Exactly. But, even our choice, which I think, I'm not the first one to talk about this, but I think it's a very important point. We don't talk about it. We don't take pride enough, is the selection of the word choices, fundamental freedoms, fundamental rights. That's not used anywhere. That's our usage. That's our particular formation of words. And by doing so, that means we have to interpret it in a Canadian way.
Exactly. No, absolutely no question. And I think that's the sad part about it. In the same way as you, when you began the interview, in talking about we don't value our country in the way individual rights in the same way as they do in the United States. And I don't know if you realized it when you said that a few minutes ago, how enormous that point has become, because what has happened to our nation in the last 3 years or so, and started to happen right after the charter was approved, by the way, is this notion that our constitution is up for grabs anytime something comes up.
Yeah.
That therefore it's almost ruled by whoever is in power and whatever group of judges inhabit the courts.
Right.
And that's a very extremely dangerous road to go down, because these kinds of precedents being set out of the COVID pandemic situation lead to a situation where in the future governments and courts will have a precedent at their disposal to use to justify other violations of our Charter of Rights and Freedoms.
Absolutely.
Which should not be allowed.
Precisely. Exactly. Don't create a precedent that needn't be created in the first place.
Yes.
What would you say then too? Like, I mean, I know it's something that always comes up. It came up during the pandemic. It came up during the, it comes up all the time. It has come up with reference to Quebec a lot too, is the wording, and I would say even the creation of it, like of our particular notwithstanding clause in the Constitution.
Right.
Is that something that is vital to it, necessary given our particular federation, or is it something that is becoming less valuable as we progress as a country? And by progress,
I think it's more valuable now than it was then.
Oh, okay. I wasn't expecting you to say that. Interesting. Okay.
Because of the problems that have come up with the judiciary and with the government, right, in the interpretation of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Good point. To go back to the original, when that was being negotiated, the main reason, there were a number of reasons, but one of the main reasons that became a deal breaker is because of what Trudeau did in unilaterally trying to patriate the Constitution. If that had not been on the table, if he had not done that and continued to negotiate, we were still negotiating. The provinces never left the table. It was the Prime Minister who left the table. We were still willing to sit down and talk about these things. Remember, as I said, 34 of the areas are charter, and then the others, leading to 60, are Aboriginal rights, equalization, right? Non-renewable resources.
Yeah, huge one, that one.
Huge, and Aboriginal rights was huge. Mm-hmm. So these were all part of the package. But how the notwithstanding clause gained a lot of traction within the Charter, where there could be, the provinces could opt out for a period of time and then have it renewed after 5 years, is precisely because of the actions of the Prime Minister,
right,
and the federal government at the time. And now, for people like me, I can't speak for any of the First Ministers now because it's different, and they seem to be more willing to be soft on this point. But people like me, you will find, would be harder on that point, because we now understand that notwithstanding clause still has great validity for us, because we don't want to see the Charter and all of these things suddenly being manipulated by the federal government and the judiciary, which have taken the federal government's side extensively on this matter.
Absolutely. And it's funny too, I think Trudeau Senior, I mean, Pierre is always portrayed, I have no qualm, I've always liked certain things he's done, but he's always portrayed, I think, because we need so many national heroes, politically or otherwise, he's always portrayed as like the JFK of our era. of that particular era in Canada, and rightly so. He was the playboy politician. He was the more outgoing one. He wasn't stuffy like the prior politicians. But was it the one element perhaps that created that unilateral disdain is the fact that he was so hard pressed on being a federalist versus being a liberal versus being something else, and that I think if he had his own way, and it's been said by so many journalists and reported, he probably would have wanted to been like the president of Canada. He wanted to have
Yeah, he didn't want the federalism of the BNA
no,
Act,
no,
and what his friends turned him down for in September 1981. That's not what he wanted, because otherwise he would have stayed at the table.
right.
But the courts, contrary to what Don Gilmore and the other historians said in that history book, we weren't disappointed at all. We were absolutely elated because we had a chance to get back at the table if he wanted a deal. And how quickly did he get back at the table? September 25, November 5.
And
of the same year, a couple of months later, because he knew, and even Gilmore admits in the history book that Trudeau knew he couldn't do anything unless he came back to the table and negotiated with the province in the true nature and spirit of federalism in Canada.
Right, precisely. And it's one of those details I think we forget. You could all, when it comes to the ongoing headbutting, ongoing political headbutting between him and, rightly so. I miss those periods as a side note. Personally, I miss them. Is between him and René Lévesque. That was due to stuffiness on Trudeau's part, as much as on René Lévesque. It wasn't just an either or. I think it's always portrayed as
exactly.
It's not an either or.
No, good for you, because I'll illuminate and validate your point through all of this. I don't know if you read my book or not.
Not yet.
2012. And it detail in the back. It does a little bio or my relationship with Trudeau and what I thought of John Crosbie at the time and others who were okay.
Right.
And it talked about repatriation at length as well. It was on the Globe and Mail bestseller list in 2012. Someday the sun will shine and have not will be no more. You can pick it up still, I think, on Kindle.
Okay, perfect.
Now, otherwise, it's sold out of print. Okay, and in there I talk about Trudeau. One of the things, as Trudeau Senior, that always fascinated me, and where history comes lots of times down to personal situations,
right? That
we tend to diminish and we enlarge their alleged adherence to a great principle, and diminish the role personality and personal relationships played into it. And in this case, I always saw it in my interactions, both individually and with others in the room, that Trudeau was overrated. His intellect and his the press put him on a pedestal. He was a brilliant man. And I always say he was so brilliant that he lost in the constitutionally in the Supreme Court of Canada. One would think that if you're going to put somebody on a pedestal like that, that they would have not done that unilateral thing. But that's where it comes in. In my dealings, Trudeau Senior was always mindful of Lévesque and others who challenged him. And he became very, very upset, very stubborn, very adolescent and childlike in those kinds of circumstances. Now, I know that's sacrilege in many parts of Canada, talking about Trudeau Senior like that, but it was true. And where, let me put it to you this way, where Lévesque could very quickly, because his English was very good too, and where Lévesque was what shall I call it? A worldly wise person. He had traveled extensively all over the world physically, as well as reading about it. Trudeau's was more academic. And when we would get into arguments and stuff, and it would be a tit for tat going back and forth between Trudeau and Lévesque, in our view, as First Ministers, Lévesque always won the debate, always won the argument, always won the point, primarily because he could weave actual examples, tell stories to make his point inject humor in making his point,
Right.
and had a more well-rounded rebuttal to a very interesting academic point than Trudeau.
Right.
And I think Trudeau always resented that. He always was on his guard. And of course, Levesque was right next to him because we sat around the table as to how when we came into Confederation.
Right.
Right. So he was on one side and Davis or whoever was on the other side of him. And then because we were last, I was right around on the other end of the table from the Prime Minister. I had a really good view of it all. Mm-hmm. But he was extremely sensitive. And right. I think his unilateral move was more personal than intellectual.
Yeah. I've always liked, I don't know if he's alive still, but the former campaign minister of Stanton, back in, if you're familiar with what I'm talking about, he was the former campaign manager, I should say, campaign manager of I forget his first name, Stanton. He was one of the presumed future prime ministers of Canada from the progressive conservative side. And he never got in. He lost against Trudeau. He was considered very stuffy, very upper Canadian accent kind of thing. And Stanton made a point in an interview back in the 90s, talking about the Constitution, Trudeau's legacy after shortly after his death, or early 2000s, actually, shortly after his death. He said right to your point, when he was being challenged, when an idea, even if it was a good idea, if it wasn't his, he had to argue it because it wasn't his.
Oh yeah, and not only argue, but get very upset about it. I mean, and the point was his intellect, his reasoning faltered because he became emotionally attached and personally attached to the view. I use the example when I would raise it with him. He'd always use the word balkanize. We're trying to balkanize Canada. You go back and read some of the news clips from the day, and the journalists love to use that term, balkanize, because the Balkans were in were in play at the time, right? In popular news, and of course the Balkans bring up the Second World War and all that kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. He always used the word balkanize, and in meetings where first ministers were privately meeting and negotiating, I often raised, and the premier would get a great charge. I would say, "Well, Prime Minister, how do you explain Switzerland?" And he would go furious. He would go furious because I said, not only are they more decentralized than Canada, they've been more successful.
Yeah.
And you link greater decentralization with non-success.
Yeah.
Whereas we have a world example of where decentralization has been a real success economically in every other way. Mm-hmm. And with all of these other, not only 2 official languages, but 4 official languages. So,
absolutely.
But my point primarily being that these kinds of interjections by other first ministers or other people at the time found little favor with Trudeau because they weren't his.
Exactly. I mean, which I think is another true statement that was said of Trudeau, and I think it's to your point of his academic view. Even as well traveled as Trudeau was himself, he seemingly had obviously academic view as opposed to an experiential view on things. And I always thought it was amusing, very bringing him down to the level of all of us, that he had a better knowledge base of Algeria, for example, than he did about Alberta. And I always thought that was, I always laugh when I hear that, because it's true. I mean, from the portrayal of him, from what documentation, books, and so forth, and what we have of interviews, that was it. He could talk of the world to an illuminating extent, but have him talk about Sudbury, have him talk about that, and that's when L falls apart.
Yeah. To try to encapsulate it, if both Trudeau and Levesque went to visit a foreign city, you would find Levesque in the marketplace sitting down with somebody, arguing or talking to a bunch of people, and Trudeau would be at the university.
Right. And it does portray a completely night and day personality. And
Right.
it does also emphasize a different placement of value too.
Right. And if you look back in history, Socrates was a person of the people. He was teaching young people.
Right.
He was mingling in the regular society of Athens. Cicero, for all of his learning, right, did likewise. I think came from a very wealthy family, Cicero did, but he made it his business. It was Cicero who went to the Senate to defend the people of his province that he was a governor of against the rape that had happened by a previous governor. And he was liked by the people of that province. So Cicero was more both sort of bifurcation of being an intellectual as well as understanding the people, if you can mix the two together.
Yes. I mean, in many ways also a father of rhetoric too, knew how to speak. I mean, it's one of the things I think on a side note of our extremely wonderful conversation is I've always think that's a shame we've done over the last 50, at least 50, maybe a little short, maybe 30 years, but at least 50 years, is gotten away from teaching Latin. And subsequently, I think that falls with the removal of cursive writing, because that's key. You want to give a child the mastery, the skills required to be a great politician, to be a great principal, to be a great plumber, to be a great, I don't care what your pursuit is in life. You have to articulate. Argumentation is a skill. It's not fighting. Fighting goes nowhere. Fighting creates wars. Argumentation is the prevention of conflict.
A lot of people, when I went to university, took history. Well, we had to take 2 histories in order to graduate, to get a degree. And one of the history courses that I did was classics.
Yeah, myself as well.
I don't know if you went into a university now, somebody just starting into an arts program, right? Well, how difficult it would be to be able to get a course in classics, Greek and Roman history.
Yeah.
And we started back. And I still, that's why I quote these people today, was mainly out of my experience of learning that, both in the school, by the way, in the high schools, as well as at university.
Precisely. I mean, my background is in classical and early modern philosophy. So Cicero is one of my favorites. As someone who has a deep love for Stoicism, I think it's a very valued school of thought and something we should invoke more often. It's not about being absence of emotion, but experiencing the right amount of emotion at the right time. And subsequently, the most important virtue, I think, not just justice, prudence, and all those, is acting accordingly.
Yes. Yeah, no question. And Cicero is a great hero of mine as well. And the English poet who wrote a biography of Cicero, I always lose his name, and I've lost it again now. It was a wonderful biography of Cicero put out by this English novelist, whose name, I'm sorry, escapes me right now. But I remember Cicero well when I did the classics thing. But that's one of our problems in Canada and in North America generally now, is this whole question of, and why over a year ago I issued my own Magna Carta, and one of the provisions in that Magna Carta was that civics should become a mandatory subject in all the public schools of Canada from grade 8 until graduation.
Yeah, I stand by you with that, Brian. I really concur with that, because that was something when we took it in my years in high school, it was something I did not shy away from. I valued it. It instilled with me, and I don't use that sentence lightly, it instilled with me, I mean, someone who always took pride in history, being my own family's history and my background, I felt so wowed by it. So wowed by the growth, the expansion, so wowed by the fact that it's not ending. It's not like there's some point, that's it, and we're just learning. It's, that textbook, that everything should be changing, because we're changing, we're growing, we're learning, we're adding to this mosaic.
Right.
I was always taken by it, but I was always, at the same time, I found I had to build my own garden, as it were, as maybe Cicero would say,
Yeah.
tend my own garden of excitement, because I found those who were teaching it had no excitement.
Yeah.
And I think
Exactly.
that's a key thing. It's a
Yeah.
key thing to have that excitement. Be proud of it. Take excitement.
Yeah.
It foster that growth of the mind.
Right.
And
Voltaire said, "Let us cultivate our garden."
exactly. Better to be a warrior in a garden than a gardener in a war.
Absolutely, absolutely, all the time.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, Brian, I must say on a final note, it's an absolute pleasure, sincerely, sir, to have you on here today, and I hope to have you on in the near future for another.